What's up, people? So, we've been going over the series what is it again, Gabe? What I wish I would have known. Yeah, hey, thanks. So last week, Kelly talked about pride. Kelly's not here, but there's my shout out to Kelly. And as I thought about what I wish I would have known this week as I was preparing this talk, the phrase came to my mind, just do you. So that's the title of my talk. Yeah, just do you. Throughout my life, when I heard that phrase, I've thought of things like just do what you want, do what feels good, do what gets you what you want. To me, that's kind of what that phrase entails. But now when I think about that phrase that our culture loves so much, that just do you, I realize that in order to just do you, you have to know who you are. And to be able to truly do you, you have to know what your true identity is. So how do we do that? So tonight, as I break this down for us, I'm going to try to touch on three questions. Those questions are, how do we define our identities? Who gets to speak to our identity? And how do we walk in our true identities? So question one is, how do we define our identities? And as I read through a lot of really smart people's essays on identity, I realized that, one, it's super complex, and two, there's a lot of essays and a lot of work that's gone into trying to figure out this complicated question. So in order to simplify it for myself, I broke it down into three basic elements. So the elements that I like so much are personal identity or inside factors, our family identity, our social identity, or outside factors. So that personal or inside factors are our internal struggle. It's the internal conversation that we have with ourselves about who we think that we are. That family is the environment that created us. It's the upbringing. It's our foundation, the things that made us into who we are from the time we were little babies. And our social identity or outside factors are the friends, activities, mentors, culture, society that we live around, the outside pieces that have influence on the decisions that we make and who we become. So I'm going to talk about my story a little bit to start here, and hopefully you can see those three elements in my story. So growing up, as I'm sure is true for a lot of you guys, my family was everything. My family was my identity. I mean, that's all I really knew, as little baby Nate. But my dad was a pastor, he was a coach, he was a mentor to a lot of people in our community, and my family as a whole just kind of knew everybody. So the family element of my identity was the son of an influential man, a pastor's kid. I was a Ferguson. And to me, this meant that I had a standard to live up to, that I had to fit the mold that my family had set before me. And honestly, I had a pretty cool upbringing. Like, I was pretty lucky in that regard. When it came to my family element, my brother and sister were star athletes and students. They were nice to everybody they knew. And my mom and my dad were both very kind people who raised us all on a solid biblical and moral foundation. But because of my upbringing, when I started high school, I vowed not to drink, not to party, not to have sex. I wanted to be the light that I saw that my family was in our community. However, because I open enrolled to Broomfield High School, when I got there, I left behind all of my friends and family and everything that I had known. I got to go home to my family every night, but no one there knew who they were. I only knew two people when I started, and I felt really alone. It was all uncharted territory for me, and I desperately wanted to make friends. So soon my desire for friends began to outweigh the convictions that I had set for myself, the goals that I said that I was going to stand to. Really, what happened is that I became more focused on making friends than I did on my goals not to do those things I just talked about. So my personal identity was the struggle between being popular and holding true to my values. Eventually, I started doing the things that the people around me were talking about. Those things just happened to be drinking, partying, having sex, the exact things that I said that I wasn't going to do. Really, I did whatever got me invited to be a part of the group of people that I wanted to be friends with, the people that I wanted to be associated with that would set up that identity for myself. So, fast forward to college. I was in the same situation. New school, no friends. But now, not only did I not have my family to go home to at the end of the day, my dad had just passed away. So, in my heart, I was more alone than ever. I chose the school that I went to, Western, because I wanted to be able to fish and spend time with God and his creation. My whole goal was to go to a place where I could completely dive into his word and really get to know God at the river and the stuff that he created. Thought it would give me the opportunity to grow closer to Jesus and become a better person. But the trick is that I hadn't learned anything from my identity struggles in high school. So I fell into that same spiral. I joined the rugby team, and I completely forgot about my original plan for college. I wanted to be a part of the team, so I started doing what I thought would make them accept me. The old trap was set again, and I stepped right in. And I wanted to be part of something so bad that I let go of what Jesus was calling me into. I let go of this beautiful opportunity to grow closer to him just so I didn't feel alone. I'm sure a lot of you catch the funny part about that. If not, I'll talk about it later. So, I started using drugs, and I started doing things that I thought I wouldn't do. I went to my classes high or drunk or both. And I wanted to be a part of something so bad that I let go of everything, like I said. When I let go of that hope, I fell into that darkness of my loneliness. I let the sorrow of missing my dad and of being alone take total control of my life and total control of my identity. So what happened to me and my identity is that the people that I surrounded myself and had all the influence on the decisions that I made. I stopped relying on who I knew that I was in my internal struggle, and I stopped relying on who I was brought up as in my family, and I just focused on that social piece. So once all that had taken hold, my internal struggle of loneliness latched onto that social and said, let's just follow this train. I knew that I had lost who I was, but I convinced myself that I was in way too deep. And since I didn't have any friends as a freshman in college to remind me who I was, I became someone else. See, it's really hard for us to decide and define who we are completely on our own. But here's the thing. We have a cheat code. The one thing that all those really smart people that wrote all those articles that I talked about missed is Jesus. See, I would argue that God didn't intend for us to make the determination of who we are on our own. I believe that the only way we can define ourselves is by listening to Jesus and the people who are around us, and by paying close attention to who those people are. So to illustrate this a little bit more, I'm going to talk about Paul the Apostle before and after his relationship with Jesus. Conveniently, as a lot of you know, Paul was called Saul before he knew Jesus, so that makes the distinction pretty easy. So Saul versus Paul, and we're going to go over that question now of who gets to speak to your identity. So first we're going to talk about Saul, or better yet, we're going to see what Paul, future Saul, has to say about Saul. So in Philippians 3, verses 4 through 6, says this, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Those are some bold claims. Out of all the laws in the Torah, he says he's blameless. That's nuts. But without getting into the nitty-gritty of all the specifics here, I'm just going to paint a little picture. So Saul was defined by the society that he lived in and the religious culture that he lived in. He was even defined by his family and what that meant to his culture. And by the standards of what he held as his priorities, Saul was the best of the best. He really was. He was a top dog, at least by those standards. Saul's identity was wrapped up in his works. He was wrapped up in being a Pharisee. Saul was super prideful. He even believed that you earn your way into heaven, which we know is not how it works. He rejected anything to the contrary, especially Christians. He persecuted those who threatened the core tenets of his identity. He even approved of the killing of Christians like we see in Acts 8, verse 1, when he let a Christian named Stephen be stoned. He even approved of it just for speaking of Jesus and how the Pharisees had completely missed the point of his ministry. Do you guys see the points of identity in Saul's story? He was completely attached to that social aspect, he was attached to the culture that he lived in. And his family, being Hebrew, tied him even harder to that. But now is the cool part. It's the turning point for Saul. In Acts 9, verses 1 through 6, it says this. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. So, yeah, Jesus blinded him on the road to talk to him. That's pretty nuts. And fast forward to Acts 9, 19 and 20. It says, For some days he was with the disciples at Damascus, and immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues, saying, He is the Son of God. That's a crazy turning point. And that's a really crazy interaction with Jesus. I think we can all argue that if Jesus showed up in our life and said, or blinded us and talked to us, that'd be pretty wild. But I want you guys to realize something here. Is that on the surface, that sounds like Saul changed his ways because of this crazy experience. But remember how deeply his identity was attached to his culture and his upbringings. He was a Pharisee, a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Hebrew who memorized the Torah and knew it inside and out. He persecuted people for believing what he just proclaimed as true. And that's huge. That couldn't have been easy for Saul. It went against everything he knew and identified with. Clearly, he completely went back on what he so boldly stood for. But now we get to meet Saul 2.0, or Paul. Paul goes on in his life to follow Jesus and build a relationship with him. He spreads the gospel to the Jews and the Gentiles, and he wrote a really big chunk of the Bible. He's one of the powerhouse people of the Bible. He made a complete 180, as we see in his letter to the churches of Galatia, where he talks about Jesus delivering us from evil, and how there's only one gospel and not to be led away by anyone or anything claiming anything to the contrary. He even speaks of his strong feelings against people who try to preach anything that is not the one true gospel. That's a big flip. Like, he just was on the opposite side of that, persecuting people for believing what he just said was true. What I think is awesome about this is that Jesus chose Saul to spread the gospel even after all that he had done to his people, after all that he'd said about Jesus. And I find freedom in this example of God's grace because it reminds me that nothing we do disqualifies us from being a part of his story. That God's love for us has no restrictions and no limits. That he can and will use our story, no matter how gnarly it is, to spread his word. All we have to do is choose to listen to him, to follow him, and to look to him for our identities. Paul's life touches on that question that I asked earlier. Who gets to speak to our identities? Or another way of putting it, who gets to define who we are? And I think he makes that clear in Galatians 1, verse 10, which is part of that letter I was talking about, when he says, For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I am still trying to please man, then I would not be a servant of Christ. When Paul left his old identity behind, the one that was controlled by the world, Jesus transformed his identity into a servant of God. And once he stopped listening to his culture, his society, and his upbringing, and started listening to Jesus, he experienced freedom and walked with Jesus and found his true identity. That true identity that Jesus knew about all along, even when he was persecuting Christians. Check it out. It's cool, too, because Paul even got to remain a religious leader. He was a religious leader as a Pharisee, and as he started following Jesus, he was still a religious leader. But with that small change of who he let define him, he got to bring light to the world. So back to me. In my life, like I said earlier, I was consumed by my desire to make new friendships. I was consumed so much that I started listening to the wrong people for how to just do me. And in that process, I completely lost me, and I was doing what everyone else said I should do. I gave up on that internal struggle, on that personal part, and just went to everyone else for it. Because I was so afraid of being alone, I chose company that didn't really care about me. But now, by the grace of God, I'm getting back to me. Now I have a much better idea of what I should do when I hear that phrase, just do you. And because I started listening to Jesus again and surrounded myself with people who were close to him, I have a better idea of who I actually am. And as I walk in my new identity, trusting Jesus, lost my spot. I don't have to do what everyone else is trying to make me do just to make friends. I get to ask Jesus what he thinks and then just walk in that. It's easier to make friends or real friends when I am me, and I hope you guys know that too. When you're just your true self, it's way easier to make actual friends who care about you. These friends that I've made along the way have turned out to be some incredible people who respect each other for not conforming to the world, who respect each other for just being who they are. They see the beauty in you like Jesus sees the beauty in you. So now when I feel alone, I can always turn to Jesus and be reminded of who he says I am. I'm not going to lie, sometimes it's still hard, right? Sometimes I still feel alone, but now I have somewhere to go with that. I have an outlet. I have someone that can talk to me about that I can talk to about that. And aside from friendships, I have a new freedom in my life because I follow Jesus. God has opened so many doors for me, and he's given me the freedom to experience and try things that I want to with him. And it's way better that way. And then the answer to that last question, how do we walk in our true identities? I think that answer is in Romans 12, verse 2. It says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. You know, this is such a complicated topic, apparently, this identity thing, but I think the answer is pretty simple. It's stay close to the source of your identity and just do your best in every situation, every moment. That's it. That's all the answer is. So the things that I hope you guys take away from this today, which is what I wish that I would have known when I was younger, is that our identities are ever changing. We all are works in progress. So our identities are always in a process too, just like Saul to Paul. Be careful who you guys give the privilege of speaking to who you are. Surround yourselves with people who talk to Jesus and can tell you who he says you are. I mean, who better to tell us who we are than the one that created us? And who better to help us understand that than people who talk to him and spend time with him? So just stay close to Jesus because he loves you deeply and he knows you better than anyone else. The cool thing is that Jesus will enter each one of those elements of identity that I talked about, and he can bring healing and clarity as you walk with him. That's that cheat code. And he's the only one who can do that. And last, breathe. Just do your best and lean into his grace. Sometimes you're going to fall short. I fall short all the time. But I know that if I go back to Jesus, he's already forgiven me and he loves me. Just cut yourself some slack because you guys, you're a work in progress. Hey, band, you guys can come up here. Should have said that like 2 minutes ago. So I just want to pray with you guys now. Father, I thank you, one, for the opportunity to come up here and talk to everybody. And I thank you that you want to use my story to remind everyone and myself that it's okay when we fall short. And that in time with you that we can learn who we are. That we don't have to listen to the world around us, no matter how enticing that might be. That we can turn to you, and we can turn to our community who loves you. Father, I pray that everyone here would remember that they're fearfully and wonderfully made. That you have a plan for them and that we can't derail that. That you're working with us in every moment and in every situation. We just got to keep going and stay close to you. So, Father, I thank you for the way that you love us. I thank you for who you are in our lives, that you constantly pick us up and dust us off. First, in your holy name we pray. Amen.